Welcome to All About Impact, the official podcast of Imagine If Insights and Strategy. I'm your host, Susan Petoyan. All About Impact is the only podcast in the world that is exclusively dedicated to the art and science of creating real and positive impact with data, research, and insights. We push ambitious marketers, practitioners, and users of data, research, and insights to create meaningful, tangible, real-world impact with their work. Join us as we bring you diverse perspectives from hand-picked impact champions, incredible cross-disciplinary leaders who are masters at activating insights to transform business and achieve unparalleled success for their teams, organizations, careers, and of course, customers. Now is the time to venture into the world of influence and impact far beyond data and insights. Tune in today and boldly unleash the impact champion in you. In this episode of All About Impact, my guest is Dr. Ani Ziyalyan, Vice President of Organizational Change Management and User Experience Research at First American Title. Ani's passionate about change, specifically orchestrating seamless transitions and empowering organizations to embrace change by focusing on the people side of transformation. Imagine this daily occurrence in the insights industry. You just wrapped at that killer presentation, great story, you had lots of data, people in the meeting actually liked it. You're done. You can check that one off your list and go home, right? If you said yes to this, then this episode is for you. You see, the change, the delta in the decision makers' hearts and minds still needs to happen. Do you think that's your responsibility? The real work of impact starts now with change and actual change management planning. Tune in and take notes. Hello, and welcome to another episode of All About Impact, Imagine If's podcast, specifically dedicated to creating positive impact with data, research, and insights. Today, I'm extremely pleased and proud to introduce to our audience one of my greatest friends and someone that I learn a lot from through her posts and through her work, Dr. Ani Ziyalyan. Ani is the Vice President of Organizational Change Management and User Experience Research at First American Title. Obviously, that's a big job. Ani's very passionate about orchestrating good transitions, seamless transitions, and empowering teams, organizations to embrace change as opposed to hide from change by focusing on what I think is one of the most important things in the toolkit for all professionals these days, regardless of industry, the human side, the human factor in transformations. Ani, I'm so excited to start this conversation. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Susan. I am so happy to join you today. I've heard great things about your podcast, your organization, and I'm thrilled to be one of your guests and to speak with you on this topic today.
Awesome. Thank you, Ani. In the past, we've talked about maybe some of these things. We've touched on a few of these things, but your career has changed a lot over the years. Not changed, but you transitioned to new roles, expanded responsibilities. And, as someone who started with academic roots, I would love to start by having you tell our audience a little bit about kind of where you started and, how you ended up where you are leading change management and UX research at First American.
Excellent. Thank you. So academically, Susan, I have a PhD in industrial organizational psychology, which has really been that foundation to help me spring into this career within change management and research. I've actually been in change management for over 20 years. I've worked for various industries, including aerospace, entertainment, utilities, real estate, and now I'm at First American Title Insurance. I have a broad background in change management, program management, organizational development, training, and related fields. It's been quite a ride. It's been very exciting. And quite frankly, I do believe that having that vast experience in different industries and different roles has positioned me well to be where I am today and has really given me that broad experience to see different types of change efforts and transitions from different lenses and different perspectives. Before we dive in, I do want to just make sure I mention that my remarks reflect my views on the topics we're going to discuss today and do not necessarily represent the views of First American in any way.
Awesome. And I am sure those opinions, your observations, lessons and insights are so rich, just given the breadth of experience, the diversity of contexts and types of change, I'm sure, above and beyond macro change, such as a global pandemic, that we're going to learn a lot. And this topic is particularly interesting for me because, change is everywhere, of course, but doing change as opposed to having change happen to us, teams, individuals, companies, etc., is a completely different endeavor. And people in your line of work or people who are in change management or have to be adjacent to change management, they often have to think about moving the needle, like making progress or moving, producing momentum, moving in the right direction with change, but in these large entities, such as a big brand or a large complex organization, which seem to be monolithic or so massive that sometimes it might feel like it's hopeless to create that delta, that movement forward. So, Ani, let's start with a simple kind of, level-setting question that I have started all of my conversations with so far. You use data, your teams use, I'm sure all your stakeholders, your team in particular, especially being UX research head as well. Data and insights are super important. They're everywhere. I think it's fair to say that most companies know that they have to pay attention to data. And when the data points in a certain direction, such as the necessity for change, right? Doing something different, embracing a new idea, I don't know, launching a new brand or sub-brand or product, whatever, right? Often that data, it does not have the impact. It does not have the effect that it should if we want to pay attention to the message from the data, right? So idea that data is enough, is sufficient to create or propel change feels wrong. Not wrong, but it feels like it's necessary but not sufficient, right? So let's start off with a simple question of why is it so hard to move, I'm chuckling, I'm not laughing, to move cultures, companies, teams forward to create change in the first place? Maybe you can start off by educating us, our audience, on kind of the top 2 or 3, barriers that you consistently have seen, both from your academic research all the way through real world corporate examples.
So very interesting question. And it's definitely a challenge that may not be simple to address. But as we know, there could be a myriad of reasons organizations may have cultures or that are change resistant. And of course, varying degrees of resistance, right? Some organizations are very much looking forward to change and welcome it with open arms. Others may have more of a resistance or may push back on changes. So as change professionals, especially if we have access to true and rich data, we can dive into uncovering the root cause of resistance or the fear of change and changing. So often people say change is bad, change is hard, and they fear changing. Mm-hmm. But I actually often say change is not a bad thing. In fact, people welcome change if it's really introduced and positioned in the right way, right? There are many industries that rely on the ability to influence change and on people's willingness to welcome change. I mean, thinking about the fashion industry, the automotive industry, the music industry, they really rely on people's desire for change in order to thrive and to succeed. So how do they do it? And what makes them successful in getting people to welcome change, look forward to change? Of course, they rely on market research, various studies, and a lot of data. But to truly get people to change and welcome the change, there are some important change management strategies that need to be implemented. For example, identification of a strong change sponsor or influencers who help change the mindset of the target audience or stakeholder groups. That's why we see so many celebrities wearing the new style of clothing, the new colors that are coming into fashion, or athletes who are sponsors of different cars or apparel. right? We also view commercials that outline the benefits of getting that new car with the latest and greatest technology that's going to revolutionize your life. How could we resist, right? When all these things are presented and you look at it and you're like, that's how I want to look. That's exactly what I need. So although I'm giving you examples of how to influence a set of the population, the same concepts apply to organizational change, right? So how do you create momentum towards positive change? Well, to name a few things, you have to start with a clear vision. Where are you today and where do you want to be? So what is that desired state that you're trying to reach? How does the idea of the future state look? Like what does it look like, right? Be transparent about the change and where you're headed. Make sure you talk about the benefits of the change and address what's in it for me factors for various organizational groups. Make sure that you identify credible and influencer change sponsors and advocates for the change, similar to your celebrities, or now we have social influencers and clothing brands send social influencers free outfits for them to model and show. That's your change models. Those are your sponsors within an organization, right? We often ask our executive leaders to model the change so that their teams and employees follow them. And all that is really based on that market research. It's really based on that internal user data. If you've set up the right support activities, you can reduce anxiety. But in order to know what that there is anxiety and what those right support activities and resources are, you really need to pull that information from your employees and from various stakeholder groups within an organization. That's how you address potential resistance to change. And all of these things I mentioned are just a subset of strategies that can be implemented to influence change. And of course, without strategic change management planning and thoughtful execution, it's inevitable that you'll face many obstacles to creating momentum, ultimately slowing you down, completely holding you back from reaching that desired state. But what I just shared are just a few examples of how you really influence that mindset,
right,
or help drive that cultural change and welcome change rather than being resistant to it.
And I love how all of that feels like a short form version of a course or something that you can probably teach, which I understand you also do as well. I mean, exactly what you teach, and what do you teach when you do have time to teach?
I teach part-time I'm not a full-time professor. I teach part-time and I teach a course called organizational consulting and facilitation. So whether you're an internal consultant, for example, a change management consultant internally for the organization, or externally, how do you consult? What are those steps to consulting? And then how do you facilitate meetings and conversations and drive things forward? So all those combined as part of the course that I teach.
Awesome. Sounds like a great way to get some theory, and then in the real world, messy, non-compliant, I don't mean in the HR legal term, but, non-conforming and constantly moving influx reality of corporate. Ani, that was such a rich answer to the question of just the barriers. I want to quickly hit on a couple of things, but you also kind of provided a little bit of a view into what it takes to overcome those variables. And the first thing that I think struck me is the resistance, is both a cultural, but also almost like a psychological mindset kind of barrier, which I think we all feel when we're sitting around a table where this is a 500-pound gorilla, but people are still not kind of committing or agreeing or making that decision that they need to make to move forward. Or anytime there is, some new change that's going to come down from management announcement or whatever, there's this, constant organizational anxiety that's in the air. There was a lot of layoffs recently, still some going on as we record this. The psychology of change is definitely one thing, and it's very interesting. There's lots that can be done. There is also, in my head, there's also kind of infrastructural readiness for a new state, assuming there's a clear vision and, by the way, a champion too. But I don't know if infrastructural readiness is the right terminology, but it's basically how much of the resistance, the psychological resistance to change is because the company or the environment, the atmosphere, or the context has not been technically prepared for that change. What comes first? The behavioral, like, okay, we're going to do these things differently because now we have SAP or some new technology or whatever, as opposed to we need to start in our heads, we need to think, feel differently before some of those new tools and, again, technologies, whatever, have been introduced. What comes first, the behavior or the thinking?
Very good question. So it's hard to put one ahead of the other, right? And often when we think about any sort of organizational change, we think in technology, process, and people. And all of them are equally important. I wouldn't necessarily put one ahead of the other. I would say focusing on all three aspects at the same time is critically important. Often when you introduce new technology, it impacts processes, existing processes, right? Standard operating models. It also impacts people's behavior and the way they function and their preference around their work. If you introduce a new application, people often say, if it's not broke, why are you fixing it? It was working just fine. We were all performing and we were all doing our jobs. Why do we need this new technology? Or what if it doesn't create efficiencies? What if it actually does hold me back, right? So when introducing a new change, whether it's a process change, a technology change, really helping people understand what that future state looks like, being transparent about it is what would help reduce anxiety towards the change, right? So you said the word resistance really popped up there for you, and that's the whole psychology behind it. But often there's resistance because of ambiguity, right? People don't really know where they're going to land. They feel comfortable in the current state because they know exactly what is required of them. They know the current ways of working and the norms. And if you introduce a change, often there's anxiety or resistance because they don't know what the future state is going to look like. People are not aware whether or not they're going to succeed. So in order for us to address that effectively, we often put various steps in place to ensure that people understand there will be support resources. These are the support resources that will be available for you. Here's what the future state looks like. I mean, I've done different things like introduction of a sneak peek video. Here, we're going to give you a sneak peek into this new platform that you're going to get. It's going to change the way you do things. It's going to speed things up, but really focusing on the positive of change and helping address what will happen? How will their world look different going forward? Does that answer your questions?
Yeah, I think so. Basically, to kind of highlight the main idea, a lot of the important nuances that you brought up is that it's complicated. There is no simplified do this and then do that. You have to think on multiple altitudes, right? You have to think heart, mind, and body or behavior on many fronts at the same time, which sounds like a very complex thing to do, especially when you're involved in a slow moving, like a traditional industry or a company that's, 100-year-old company, let's say, like a brand that's been around for a while, etc. So to go back to two other things that you said. So the role of data and looking at market research, looking at employee research, looking at, trends, whatever the change is that we're trying to introduce or manage, right? Like, how do you see the role of data and data practitioners, people who are in charge of figuring out what data is needed, packaging that data, telling the stories, sharing, socializing, etc. What is the role of data? Break it down for us when it comes to introducing these new ideas. Whether it's a light change of like, hey, something nice and easy, or a complete, like, we're going to rebrand, we're going to split, I don't know, we're going to acquire another company, let's say, whatever, right? What is the role of data and how should it guide change creation?
So I think data itself could be a change catalyst, right? And I think, defining a change catalyst, it could be a person or a thing that causes a change or an event to happen. It's what really sparks that change, right? And in some situations, data and insights are exactly what triggers a change. I think data and research is very important and plays a very impactful role as a change catalyst. it serves as a strong change catalyst and can certainly have great impact and influence change from many aspects. I mean, let's take healthcare industry as an example, right? Healthcare organizations often rely on data, whether it's qualitative, quantitative, or comparative, to help address vulnerabilities around patient or safety or healthcare options. And the insights gathered through that research help guide meaningful change to improve the respective areas that they were looking into. So without that patient data, as an example for specifically healthcare companies or that industry, decisions on how to manage risks and provide better care would be very difficult to make.
So lots of risk, lots of uncertainty, lots of potential pitfalls all over the place. Ani, if that is, I think everybody would agree that data is critical in at least understanding what change to instigate, whether it's intentional or in reaction to, let's say, an external force factor. But it still fails in winning hearts and minds. In my particular kind of function, which is market research, consumer insights, whether internally or externally, you can tell amazing stories. You can show, the target team, let's say target meaning like the senior management team or particular department lead, decision makers, etc. You can show all kinds of statistics. You can make amazing, compelling business cases based on the data. You can show it continue, on and on. You can track and monitor and really, really kind of bring that constant flow of data into the organization, to the right people, feed it to them. But they still often, right, very often, they still don't want to change it. It does not win hearts and minds, even though rationally it does. I'm sure it makes a dent. It has an impact, but it is not able to change. And consumer insights individuals, professionals, deal with this a lot, especially when the topic is a new idea. Let's say, competition is doing something. We should do that too, because we can, let's say the brand, whatever the case is, right? But we are not doing it because somebody internally is not agreeing or whatever the case might be. There's some kind of resistance. So it's a very important barrier for having impact with data and insights, regardless of whether the data itself is the catalytic factor, right? If it's the medium, it's the tool that's being used to guide or instigate change. What doesn't work with data first approach or data only approach in either catalyzing or kind of moving, introducing new ideas, and let's just talk about positive change for a second, just to make this discussion easy. Introduction of new ideas or becoming a little bit more innovative, whatever the case might be.
What does not work is that
why is it that data, despite all the power and all the truth conveying characteristic that comes with data, that data has, right? Data and insights, it's still not enough. It often just doesn't work. It feels like it goes over, people's head. I mean, it doesn't go over people's heads, but it's just not effective. Alone, not effective.
Data alone may not be sufficient to win the hearts and minds of people. There may be times where you show data, right? And you say, here's, based on our research, here's what we found. And you may still have people who are really not bought into what you're saying. And so it's not enough to just show data and rely on data. You really need to get to the psychology and the hearts and minds of people. It's really getting people to buy in on what you're saying and the change. And sometimes you actually require their input and have their input reflected in the data for them to actually agree with it and look at it and really understand it and rationalize it. So that's one way that you can make data more effective in that scenario. But it's really getting people to talk about it, to peel the layers of the onion, help them understand what the data is saying. Is there a story behind it? It's not enough to just show bars and charts and graphs and say, well, here's where the industry is going. Here's our retention rate. Here's this, but tie it to a story. You have to make it meaningful for the people that are consumers of that data. Otherwise, it's just numbers. In some situations, I've also used data to create more of a competitive, just competitiveness within teams, right? Because I can certainly say, I'm looking at adoption rates. We've rolled out this platform and I'm looking at adoption, and here's the data around adoption. 30% of our people have utilized this new platform or have really adopted to this process. Well, that's great. We just saw a number and that's data. But when you break it down into individual teams and you recognize one team who's doing much better than all the other ones, right? And you say, congratulations, this is incredible. And you really appeal to the positive psychology, that positive side, right? You all of a sudden create this internal competition and positive momentum towards a change. But again, you're bringing it down to what does it mean for me? It's not just a number. You've now put me in this situation where I have a friendly banter with my colleagues and I say, my team can do better than your team. But it now means something different. It's part of a story. It's part of this race that you're in right now, right? And it's sort of, you lose sight of the adoption aspect and now you're racing for that goal and that finish line. You can do a lot with data, but you just really have to understand the mindset of your audience and really appeal to them. Appeal to the psychology, the psyche behind it, and not just show charts and graphs. We have data everywhere, as you said, right?
This is great, Ani, because it highlights so many things. So one is basic comprehension. Just because you deal with data doesn't mean all the other stakeholders or different teams, etc., process information in the same way. So you have to speak their language. The relevance or meaning factor, right? You want to make sure that it's relevant and meaningful to them. Often that comes down to humanizing, or at the very least making it personal, right? So that they have that emotional kind of connection, etc. But also a little bit of, what I would say maybe the competition element that you talked about, great analogy, maybe gamifying it or taking the emphasis away from the thing that we need to do, but to the why and how does it affect me, right? And doing all of this through a positive lens, because you're arguing that people are more likely to adopt change or do things differently if it's a positive kind of force as opposed to out of fear. Great. Another important thing, again, we all talk about this, but it's really hard, especially data people like data scientists, data oriented, people who want to be objective and just deliver the data and not add the interpretation or not add the story. The idea of having that story, making sure it's accessible, but also that it tells a story. This is a great list for someone's kind of how-to when it comes to really using data for any kind of change, whether it's a big organizational thing or a small audience of teammates that you're trying to, work with on something. Now, the scale question is still there, I think, Ani. The idea that in the largest of organizations, your model of change, by the way, one more thing I'm going to say. It was in your first answer. So you said that you have to have a model. You have to employ some kind of a model for the change that you're trying to introduce. For our audience, a lot of our audience being people who are marketers or, marketing, like users of data, buyers, practitioners of data, that to me translates into the idea of how thoughtful, intentional are you in how you're going to introduce, not starting with your data, but your story. You need to make it easy for people, which means you need to have at least some kind of a plan. It might not be a big model, but some kind of a communication plan, step by step, with lots of clarity, etc. And I think a lot of people don't do that. They're like, here's what the market wants, here's what the consumer wants, here's what the competition is doing, go, as opposed to a facilitation stage after that guides people, here's the journey that we're going to go through. And by the way, it's a journey we're going to go through together, right? Because they'll be more psychologically vested. Awesome. So we need a model. We don't just need a great story that's relevant, meaningful, and easy to understand. We also need a model. So you said earlier that a model in a complicated or like a huge, like a GE, I'm just making this up. Any of these large brands that are multinational, 100 different divisions, B2B, B2C, digital, everything. What happens to the importance of having a model when you're trying to move this big giant just to 1 inch or just a little bit, right? As opposed to a nice little, digital product, an agile tech company that's like, zigzagging left and right, pivoting nonstop, very different change management propositions there. So talk to us about what to do when you're in a large context and a single catalyst or change agent or a whole team might feel disempowered, might feel like, oh my God, it's so above me. I'm never going to move, despite all the signals from the market, despite all the signals, from whatever the topic is, from all the different places.
Looking at any change, if you look at it holistically, it always seems a little daunting, right? It's never simple. If it was simple, we could very easily send out one email or communication or presentation and say, well, everyone should have gotten it, right? Everyone should be bought in now and excited, enthusiastic about this change. And it's not that simple. I wish it was, but it's really not. Context matters a lot. It really depends on the type of change, the organizational value, the culture. So all those things play a big factor into how you create that change management model or strategy and really create that momentum towards change. So one thing that's critically important at the get-go is you have to make change relevant. When introducing a new initiative, a new transformation, you have to make it relevant for the different audiences. A change or an implementation means something different to your CEO and it does to your directors, vice presidents, managers, and your individual contributors. And then further to that, it means something different by each operational group, right? Depending on what each group is doing. So it is important to make it relevant. And so the model that we apply from a change management standpoint is know your audience, which I'm sure also applies to marketing strategists, right? Know your audience, but know your audience in a segmented way. Really hone in. Who are your impacted stakeholder groups, right? If we implement this new technology, if we implement this process change, or if we're really looking at making a cultural shift, who is my audience is where you start. This is something we call a stakeholder and impact analysis. This is a critical part of change management strategy and planning. You do a stakeholder impact analysis. You gather information from different groups within the organization. This is, again, data gathering, but it's done in more of a conversation format. I would not ever conduct a survey organization-wide and ask them to help me understand what challenge you're going to face or what will motivate you to really adopt to this. That's just not done in a survey. And this is the intangible part of change management, the soft skills of change management that are critically important and needed to build that trust, to build that ability to connect with your audience, identify the right people in the organization, and really hone in on how is this relevant for you? What is going to encourage you or motivate you to change? So you start with that stakeholder and impact analysis. You identify your individual stakeholder groups. You identify, what does this mean for you? What does this mean for accounting? What does this mean for the marketing team? What does this mean for finance? So it's different, right? It's different by stakeholder group, by your audiences. And then depending on the complexity of the change, whether it's large or small, the timing of your rollout may also be very different. Yeah. Some groups may be impacted before others. Let's not forget the psychological aspect of change implementation, right? Often we say people go through the Kubler-Ross model of grief, which is you're in denial. This can't be happening. You can't be taking away what I've been using all these years and introducing something new, right? So we have to consider the psychological change curve, we call it. But again, it's different by audience. The timing may be different. The impacts may be different. The motivators could be different. Even the communication avenues. Some teams prefer email. Other teams prefer to have all hands meetings where you are there to announce that something is impacting them or coming their way. And just creating those open lines of communication where people feel comfortable to raise questions, to provide feedback. And that's one way you gather information about resistance. Depending on the types of questions that are coming in, you can sense whether or not there's organizational resistance or if people are really excited about the change. I've had projects that I've led where people said, when can I get this? When is this coming, right? I'm so excited about this. I'm looking forward to it. And it was, yes, it's coming in Q1 or it's coming later this year. But there's that level of excitement where people are reaching out and saying, when are we actually going to get our hands on this? And it's great to have that. But then depending on employee feedback or user feedback, you also get resistance, and you develop different strategies to address both.
This is the bread and butter for marketing, marketing campaigns or initiatives for business strategy. We have to go through those key, sometimes in the old days it used to be called the 4 Ps or 5 Ps, like who's the person, like who's the target. You, especially in large companies, you definitely have to kind of have a strategy of how you're going to, I don't want to say divide and conquer, but what segmented, customized approach are you going to use, both in when you reach out to them and what you tell them, like the message needs to be customized in what language, in what order, because there's also systems effect, like this team might, going before the other team, there might be implications there, so on and so forth. So there is a science to this, but there's also a kind of set of intangibles, like you said, right? Yeah.
It's a balance. It's an art.
Exactly. And I think what I'm trying to kind of lay out here is that perhaps your lens is change management, but it's awfully similar to kind of what marketers do, what product developers do, anybody who's introducing new ideas and is trying to get the management team to agree or to greenlight, whatever. So we are all in a way agents of change, or we all have to both be on both sides of change, either affected by change, positive or negative, or catalytic kind of contributors or even change instigators, right? Like people who have to lead change. There's no shying away. I think there's no hiding. I mean, there is, the ostrich syndrome, or I don't know, syndrome, whatever the name is. Like when you go and hide and you're like, okay, this is not going to happen, the denial. But to me, to be so change agnostic, is that the right word? What I'm trying to say, to be so comfortable with change, both receiving and instigating change. What are those skill sets, those values, like some of the non-technical, intangible aspects or characteristics that we all need to have, given just the immensity and the frequency of change, or, the concept of change, which is funny, that we are all experiencing? What do we need to do to not be so affected by change, but to be okay with change, be comfortable with change?
So I'm going to go back to something I said earlier, is people often think that they fear change or they resist change because of ambiguity. They're unaware of what's coming their way. I often equate it to the trapeze artists. You're standing on a platform and you're comfortable on your platform. Everything's fine. You know what your platform feels like and it looks like. And then that bar swings over and you have to grab onto that bar. And then there's that transition state, right? Where you're floating through the air and you're wondering, am I going to land? Am I going to be successful on the other side? Does it feel the same as it did on first platform I was standing on? So it's that transition state that is often what is scary or anxiety inducing. And then people tend to land on that, the next platform, and they're like, wow, that was a thrill. That was so much fun. It was great to experience that. And I can now see this new platform I'm on. It's better, it's bigger, it's wonderful. And I had nothing to fear. So it's that transition state that often we try to minimize, right? To shorten that state as much as we can, to help people see that new platform. So what I would highly recommend for someone who's going through a change is trying to find ways to minimize the transition zone for them. Try to find ways to really understand, what does that future state look like? What are those benefits? How can I get ahead and really understand, what does that new platform look like and feel like? Are there resources out there that I can read? Are there sneak peek videos that I can watch? What can I do to really get a good grip and good sense of what that new platform is going to look like and feel like, and what I can do on it? So minimizing that transition phase is going to really help someone accept that change, look forward to it to a certain extent, and minimize that anxiety towards it. So both reduce the ambiguity through education, whatever means possible, but also shorten that transition. Absolutely.
That's great. Ani, that's such a simple yet powerful way to explain that. I feel like it's a kind of a light bulb, at least for me, because we always talk about change. It's, it's ongoing. It's not easy. The implied message is that it's going to be long, process. But the loss of control, based on what you're saying, is really the sense of like, I have no control, this is happening to me, is with the ambiguity plus the long, or the transitioning is where I think it just compounds and becomes really daunting, like you said in the very beginning. Ani, I know we hit on so many different things. As we kind of wrap this up, we talk about creating positive change, affecting positive change, positive outcomes, a good impact, good positive impact. Is there anything else that you feel like we should mention in the toolkit for doing data-driven change, regardless of the size of the company or the situation?
If regardless of the size of the company or situation, I think one thing I definitely want to mention is that every organization is so different in so many aspects. I mentioned that I've worked for different industries, different kinds of companies, and different change efforts, right? Systems implementation, mergers and acquisitions, you name it. I've either done it or I will at some point in my career. The way initiatives are rolled out matters a lot. And the organizational culture matters a lot. Readiness for change matters a lot. I mean, you name it. So many things contribute to moving the needle and moving the change. And all those things also contribute to shaping the change strategy, right? In terms of making sure that you have data and that you compound data with your change approach and strategy. That's another unique aspect that I think each organization has. In some organizations, you have more access to data than others. For example, you can easily get information from HR in some organizations, whereas others are very protective of that data. In some companies, you can survey. You can survey all day long. You can survey whoever you want and gather information that way. In other companies, you can't. They're very protective of the amount of time employees spend on things outside of their immediate work responsibilities. So in terms of adding tools or mentioning tools to the toolkit, I would say look for availability of data. Try to make decisions utilizing data ahead of time, which would provide strong input to the types of questions you will then ask during your stakeholder and impact analysis. Make sure you find opportunities to bundle existing data. You don't always have to go out and collect new data, but find existing data. Utilize that to your advantage when coming up with your change management plans and strategies.
I love it. I think we hit on so many important things. The only thing I'm going to mention and see how you feel about this, Ani, and that is these are my words, but the courage to lead. I think it's a leadership skill, perhaps, or another set of intangible kind of characteristics. But or maybe it's the sexy factor of the fashion example you gave, right? But having that visionary kind of quality, finding others like you, creating a little army, such a military negative term, but I mean, loaded term, but having like-minded people who, whether it's a top-down or bottom-up, change, not doing it alone. Obviously, if you're empowered, you're the head of a department, whatever, that's a different conversation. But often changes are hard when you're alone and you're going against all of these barriers we talked about. And the idea of pulling together like-minded people, sharing the vision, using your empathetic kind of muscle in building community, connecting, networking through a large, organization where change, again, positive or negative, is happening. I think there's something to be said on that super personal front. Do you agree with that? Any thoughts? Anything you want to add, change to that notion?
I absolutely agree with what you said. There is that personal component to actually being bought in to the change. There are many times, I want to be as transparent as I can in this answer, but there are times where I know the answer I'm looking for from a change strategy standpoint. But I don't walk into a room saying, all right, everyone, this is the answer, because I certainly won't get buy-in, in every situation. At least that's not the right way to influence the people in the room or get buy-in. But it's asking the right questions and asking them in a way that people themselves speak up. Right. I advocate for that. I agree with that. I think it's this. I think these are the benefits to this change. And right. Once you get that personal input and that having people really process that themselves and then contributing to the conversation, that personal input is what gets you that buy-in for that change and makes your change successful. So it's the way you facilitate the conversation that will help you find yourself in a room with like-minded people if you're focusing or centered on that particular change effort.
I love this. It's almost like a little, like I said, I think earlier, that it's like a little bit of a how-to guideline on so many levels, what to do with large companies, how to be on either side of change, how to build a model, but also personally how to kind of leverage your own personal talents, your own belief, your communication, etc. There's so much good stuff here, Ani. Thank you so much for this rich, generous, very informative, educational almost material that, content that we covered on a otherwise, not a very fun topic. But maybe some of us do like this and do geek out a lot. I usually end my conversations with 3 questions. They go back to creating impact. So if you wouldn't mind, tell us one small thing that you do in your life, it could be your personal life, in your work, in your community, or in the world, that you think has positive impact and does make a difference.
Something that I've done, not my entire life, but more recently, and that I've tried to do regularly, is show more of my appreciation for the value that people bring into our direct sphere. I mean, as a leader in an organization, it's important to recognize performance, which I often do. However, recognizing people's contributions at work by praising a specific accomplishment or behavior is likely more of a one-time event and tied to a specific behavioral outcome, right? Or job task. Appreciation, on the other hand, is ongoing. It's more of a sense of being valued professionally and personally. So it's your personal attributes that someone values. In the work setting, appreciation goes beyond producing things and could potentially relate to abilities that aren't directly related to performance, as I said. So an example of that is you may want to appreciate your colleagues' ability to connect with others and build trusting relationships. This is something that, not everyone does well and can do well, but you recognize it in some people. They have this innate ability to just connect with people right away and build trust. And I value that. I recognize it and I appreciate it and I call it out. You can share that you appreciate someone's ability to infuse humor in the work setting or within your family or friend circle. It's an observation. When you really find that value that someone brings and you call it out and you share that, you bring positivity not only to your own life, but to their life as well. I try to share my appreciation of individuals around me as often as I can. I certainly hope that it makes them feel good about what they bring to the table, and I hope it makes the world a better place.
And considering how busy you are and how complicated the job, the work you do of dealing with change and managing change, etc., I'm sure it's not easy to find that moment to take that breath and see someone and really kind of give that feedback, that positive feedback. That's great advice. Thank you. Or great example, Ani. Thank you. I said advice because my next question was going to be, if you wanted to give some ideas to our audience, what would be one good small thing that you encourage our listeners to do in order to have positive impact, similar to kind of what we said about you at work, in the community, or in the world overall?
I would really encourage people to focus on raising their level of positivity in the present to capitalize on their own happiness advantage. And what I mean by happiness advantage is that research has shown that our brains they actually perform better when they're in the positive, significantly better when they are in the negative. So your brain is more productive, it's more efficient and more accurate. So if we find a way to be more in the positive in the present, we can all work better. I'm sure you're going to ask, well, how can we do that, Ani? You can train your brain. Quite frankly, it's easy to train your brain if you know the strategy to implement and how to do it. So we can train our brain. And one strategy I would recommend is to write down 3 new things that you're grateful for 21 days in a row. Every single day, think about 3 things that happened today or that you noticed today and that you're grateful for. Again, 21 days in a row. When you continue to do this repeatedly, your brain retains a pattern for scanning the world for the positive rather than the negative, right? And then journal it. Journaling the positive thing that happened in the past 24 hours actually gets your brain to relive it, and it continues to put you in that positive state. I also encourage you to write one positive email a day, praising someone in your social network or appreciate their value. I mentioned that. I try to do that. So both of these things combined will not only have a positive impact on your own life, but it will create ripples of positivity in the world.
I love it. I realized you were also a fan of neuroplasticity and management of our own thoughts. I'm personally in that camp. I ended the night before whatever time that is with one or two things that I'm grateful that are often kind of on the positive side of, small things or big things, hopefully. But it's a great way to go into the night and wake up the next morning. Ani, this has been so good. Thank you so much. I can't believe we went from, how to do organizational change in large brands all the way to how to write a gratitude journal in one setting. But hey, impact is impact, and it takes all kinds and lots of art and science and personal conviction. Our audience, I'm sure, is going to want to learn more and hear more from you. Maybe on LinkedIn to follow you. Tell us where can people find you? What's a good way to get in touch with you?
The best way to get in touch with me is through LinkedIn. I am very active on LinkedIn. I often check my messages that are coming in. So LinkedIn is the best way to get in touch with.
Awesome. And I can attest to that and endorse Ani's content. When she does share, it's really good, intelligent material that helps and has an impact. Very good, Ani. Thank you again. I had a blast and learned a lot and feel validated on many things as well. So thank you again so much for your time and for your generous insight.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Susan. I appreciate your willingness to reach out and your ability to connect.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Ani. As you heard in this episode of All About Impact, if you're craving moving that needle with your research and insights, you must transcend from data and insights to the work of strategic change management. Without that, there's no impact. And what is your formula of driving impact in your organization? Impact is the next frontier of research and insights, and it could be a lot easier with the right partner next to you. Reach out to me, Susan Petoyan, on LinkedIn, and let's together discover the impact champion in you. Tune in next week for another episode of All About Impact.